and welcome to Always Take Notes.
A message from our sponsor, Arvon. Do you have a story in you, or want to test the waters of writing poetry or non-fiction? Maybe you already write, and write well, but would like to try a new form or genre, pick up some new tricks.
Enter Arvon. Arvon runs a yearly programme of in-person and online events, from 5-day residential writing weeks that take place at one of their 3 writing houses, to a flexible online programme featuring 5-week online evening courses, masterclasses, and pay-what-you-can events. Arvon's courses cover everything from commercial, genre, and experimental fiction to poetry, screenwriting, and even songwriting.
They've been running creative writing courses up and down the UK since 1968. In that time, their prize-winning tutors, many of whom may be some of your favourite writers, have unlocked the creativity of over 100,000 people. Many have gone on to be published authors and career writers themselves.
But actually, it's not about that. Writing with Arvon is about finding a supportive community of fellow writers, making like-minded connections that last a lifetime. By signing up for a course, you don't just get an acclaimed author as your tutor, you also gain a writing group to bounce ideas off long after the course is finished.
So whether it's a cosy stay at one of their writing houses in Devon, West Yorkshire or sleepy Shropshire, or a course you can do from the comfort of your sofa, Arvon works around your creative life.
Visit arvon.org/courses, that's arvon.org/courses, to learn more and give yourself the gift of writing.
Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Rachel and myself spoke with the journalist and author Madhumita Murgia.
We spoke to Madhu about making the move from science to journalism, becoming the FT's first AI editor, and her new book, Code Dependent.
It's a great episode and we hope you enjoy it. Hi Madhu, welcome to Always Take Notes. It's excellent to have you on the podcast. We wanted to start with your new book, Code Dependent, looking at AI and in particular its impact on humans and human lives. Could you start by telling us about this Uber Eats driver who fought back the algorithm, which we thought was a kind of fascinating individual story, but also how that fitted into the wider book and what you were trying to do?
Yeah, sure. So this Uber Eats driver unusually also happened to be a computer scientist who had studied at Berkeley and worked at tech companies. So he was in this unusual position of kind of understanding a little bit more about how the opaque coding systems and algorithms behind these apps work compared to the average gig worker. But it's a really fascinating story because it kind of brings home really just what a black box these delivery apps and, gig apps really are, particularly for the people who work for them. In many cases, people have no idea what their wages are going to be or how they're calculated. They don't understand how they're going to vary over a day or a week or a month. They often are unaware of why they're assigned a job. So this is all done through algorithms, through AI systems, whether it's Uber, Deliveroo, DoorDash, any of the kind of gig apps that we use. They're trying to calculate the cheapest and most efficient way to deliver something or someone from A to B. And the issue is that this opacity means that these drivers often have kind of no power and no voice if they want to fight back, if they want to question why was I paid this today and something different last week, right? So the power dynamic there is very much kind of in the hands of the tech companies and in the hands of the algorithms, really, with the individual human worker completely kind of at their mercy. And what was really fascinating about Armin was that he always has been what he calls a micro-social justice warrior. So he's always been the kind of person who, if he sees something is unfair, even if it's something really tiny, he's going to fight until it's fixed. That's kind of his vibe for life. And
he had that like massive FOI battle, didn't he, over something else that was kind of quite small.
Well, yeah, I can't remember what the FOI battle was, but he had, for example, there was a supermarket area labeled vegan, but he found like a dairy product in there. And he spent months kind of getting the county health authority to come in and look at the supermarket and then force them to change it to vegetarian so that people wouldn't be kind of tricked into believing that it was vegan. And so he's like constantly kind of having these mini battles to make sure that, you know, when people say something, it's fair and it's accurate. And when he suspected that he'd been underpaid, you know, he decided he had to fight back. He had to find a way to kind of not just fix the system, but to really understand what was going on. And I think it's just an example really of the stories in my book, which is, where do humans fit in a world of increasing automation? You know, what happens to our agency as individuals, but also how can we collectively pool our knowledge and our agency together to kind of fight back and learn more about kind of how to manipulate these systems that we are beholden to.
So was that character-driven approach kind of baked into the idea of the book from the beginning? And how did you go about finding the people that you wanted to use as illustrative of the points that you wanted to make?
Yeah, this is the question actually I get asked most by anyone who's read my book, because they are, you know, they're just often just ordinary people in unexpected parts of the world as well, like a local government bureaucrat in Salta, which is a tiny town in Argentina, or a doctor in very rural part of India, you know. And so this is really kind of outside of the bubble of Silicon Valley, as far as you can go, really. So yes, you know, from the beginning, my goal was I want to write a book which is about how our lives are changing, not, you know, how the technologies are built or how the people that we put on a pedestal who are building the technologies, you know, why they're doing it. It wasn't about that. It was about kind of, in small and large ways, how the ways that we live changing, and whether that's, you know, our relationship to the state, our relationship to one another, you know, with our children, with our own bodies and our identity. So it's in all of these different aspects of life. I wanted examples of kind of encounters and collisions with AI systems. But also it was really important to me to have the geographic spread. I wanted to look in places that you wouldn't expect AI systems to turn up in, and they have popped up, you know, all over the world, from Indonesia to Nairobi to Bulgaria. And that's why I kind of wanted to look in these unexpected places to get a sense of how it's changing things. Picking the stories was the hardest bit, because often people don't know that they've encountered an AI system. You know, you and I even wouldn't realize often when we're interacting with AI, because it's been so locked up behind the kind of apps or you know, services that we engage with, until ChatGPT, which I think is a very kind of obvious chatbot that has AI in it that we're all kind of talking to. But before that, it's been baked in a very sort of covert way. You know, people might not realize that, you know, when they're applying for benefits to the DWP in the UK, you know, the Department of Work and Pensions, that AI systems are used to decide who should get benefits, or if it might be a fraudulent application, for example. So there's all these unexpected things. In healthcare, you know, there are AI systems that help in diagnostics. So for me, it was kind of first finding a system and where it was being used, and then trying to go find somebody who had a decision that came out of one of these systems, or who had discovered that they'd been touched by it. So that was kind of the hardest work. And then it was just really about spending time with them and understanding their stories.
And this is such a kind of fast-moving field, and a book, you know, a non-fiction book takes a long time to write. How did you manage the whole factor of not being overtaken by events, or of writing something that will have, you know, a shelf life once it's produced as a book?
So I think this is, for me, the benefit was being able to zoom out, because I've been writing about AI for over 10 years now, since 2013, really, maybe even before that. When I was at Wired, it was kind of this really, you know, maverick, very cutting edge, very niche area of technology. But because Wired was the kind of publication that was looking for these sort of really, you know, frontier technology innovator stories, I happened to kind of start to see examples and applications of AI, you know, maybe much before anyone today, at least in mainstream journalism. So I was writing about kind of brain-machine interfaces that allowed people to move a prosthetic arm by thinking about it in 2013. And now we're looking at Elon Musk building something like this a decade later, right? So for me, having that benefit of the arc of 10 years, like, meant that I didn't feel the pressure of fast moving technology, because I had seen what it looked like and what the arc of it was. And it's actually, yes, it feels like the developments are all coming very quick, but this is built on decades of previous work. So to begin with, my concern wasn't what I write today isn't going to be relevant in a year's time, because I kind of understood the pace of change of technology. But also that, focusing on human stories was another way to make this timeless. Because even if, and it did happen, ChatGPT launched as I just was finishing writing my first draft of this book, which was, completely changed the public conversation around AI. But this was about the second order effects of automation and AI systems on people's lives. And these are real people. Their lives still continue. The effects are still clear. And so actually it ended up being even more relevant in a time where it feels like everything is changing, because really the risks and the harms that I showed in my book, they're really human things that aren't going to change just because the technology moves on. And it helps, I think, to bring some perspective at a time when people feel like they don't understand what's going on. So it was that grounding in people and their stories that I think felt like whether you read this today or in 2 years' time, it will still matter, and it will still help you to grapple with the issues coming out of sort of evolution of AI technologies.
I was really struck by the chapter on deepfakes, and particularly pornographic deepfakes, and the fact that the police can't do anything about them, basically, because they say they're not real, so it's not like revenge porn or something like that. Was that a particularly hard chapter to report, given how sensitive and traumatic it must have been for these women?
Yeah, I think that was an interesting one, because it felt like it didn't quite fit with the others in the book, because the others are kind of around decision-making systems and how they kind of usurp the expertise of humans who usually do those jobs. And it was kind of easier to kind of fit into that narrative, whereas the deepfake example was much more of a generative example. But now in hindsight, with the kind of explosion of generative AI, I'm so pleased that I did include it, even though it feels slightly different to the others in the book, because it kind of shows really the deep personal effect that it can have on, in this case, mostly women. And, when I first found Helen Mort, who's the poet that I focus on in the book, she's a poet in Sheffield, a beautiful writer, and just completely unexpectedly was told that there were deep fake images of her in like kind of pornographic, really kind of shocking imagery, gang rape and so on. And, for me, straight away, I wanted to figure out, how does this change how somebody sees themselves, their place in the world, and what does it feel like to not be able to redress something that's so wrong and so unfair? Kind of, how does that make a person feel? For me, I wanted the conversation to be really intimate and personal. And so, yeah, I think it was, there are two women I focus on, Helen and an Australian woman called Noelle Martin. In both cases, I really had to go beyond what they'd spoken before about, which was what happened, what did you do next, and how did it feel, and really try and probe, like, how did that change your relationship with yourself, with men? Have you dated? Like in Noelle's case, she's single, and like, how does that change her relationship with people that she dates? With Helen, it was, what about the relationship with her husband or her male friends? And also just kind of, what are the long-term effects of something like this? And it's really hard to interrogate that, I think, even if you've decided you're going to speak about this. It's such a brave thing to do, but it's very hard to be honest about how it's affected you and harmed you, right? So it was hard to get them to speak, and they both, I think, were extremely courageous to be able to talk that through. What I really wanted to bring home is how deep this goes. And even though it's not real, which might feel like, if it's not real, then why does it matter? But actually, it fractures your identity in a very permanent way.
I was struck in your writing in the book, but also in the FT piece about the kind of bureaucratization of Google, and in that TED Talk from back in 2017, that your take on tech in general seems to be, I don't know if you'd use this word, but somewhat dystopian. And I was wondering, is that, if you compare the way that you write about it compared to, say, how tech was written about 15 years ago, maybe in a publication about Wired, where a lot of it was like, wow, here's this great new device that's going to change the world and make things better. Do you think that the broader industry of writing about tech has changed, or has the world changed, or have you been on a kind of personal journey yourself of seeing the potential darker sides of some of these technologies? Does that make sense? That, like, if you look at a kind of Wired cover from 2005, it would be like, here's a great new, thing, and now it's like they're stealing our minds, whatever. How have you in general and the way we think and write about tech moved to that place?
I think about this a lot because I think my whole career as a journalist, I've grown up in this tech world, and actually my journey as a journalist has followed this exact trajectory you're talking about, because I started out in 2012, and this was the time in which you had the explosion of mobile and apps built on top of mobile. It was the year of kind of Uber and Deliveroo, when DeepMind was kind of founded and started to grow and was acquired by Google. This was when people were sort of really excited about not just the potential of technology, but were really cheering for the little guy, which is what these apps were at the time, right? They were disruptors who were coming in and taking on the incumbents, whether that was like the black cab lobby or etc. So they saw themselves, these companies, as innovators, as entrepreneurs, as the sort of upstarts, and that was the story we told at Wired as well. And so I because of that, I would say, a techno optimist, and I write about this in my introduction as well. Like, you can't not be when you kind of are constantly talking to people who give up their jobs to like start a company to build a flying car. I mean, it's just the like absolute ridiculousness, but also just like a little bit of envy that somebody can actually just do that and believe in that enough to kind of raise money for it. So I think that, there were a lot of amazing stories then, and businesses that came out of that time, technologies too, that meant that, there was a lot of optimism around it. And yes, of course, in the decade and a bit, that has dramatically changed. And that's partly because of power, right? And this is what is the whole underlying current of my book, which is that the power dynamic has completely changed. These are no longer upstarts who are disrupting the incumbents. They are the institutions. They are the incumbents. They are in many cases, exploiters of the vulnerable when it comes to, gig workers, when it comes to ad tech surveillance. In every one of these areas, tech companies have become the incumbents, really, and are now kind of facing all of the same issues of any other big industry, whether that was big tobacco or big oil, but in a much more, pervasive and insidious way, because we all kind of use the internet. We're all constantly online, and our lives are inextricably linked to the web. We can't get off it, and these are the companies that we have to interface with to literally live online, right? So we're kind of dependent on them, and it's not just us as individuals, it's governments. I talk about this in my book too. Many governments are reliant on for their infrastructure, on AWS, which is, Amazon Web Services, on Microsoft, on Google, in many cases wouldn't be able to provide public services without these companies any longer. So, it's Uber is in most cities in the world. I've taken an Uber in Buenos Aires, in Nairobi. It's changed kind of how work is looked at in these places. So I think that the story is different because the industry has changed. It's grown up. It's become, it's the power has become so concentrated. And yes, we've now seen all of the harms that have come out of it as well. So it's interesting you say that my reporting is dystopian, because I don't know if I saw it that way, but I think I have become a lot more realistic. And for me, my work, the thread through it all, is trying to kind of look behind the curtains of, these are the products that we use and the services that these companies provide that we all love and rely on. But really, how are they making money? what are the, factors at play? What are they motivated by? And how is power changing in the background? And I think with the AI industry, the question of power becomes even more important.
We'd like to come back to your book a bit later on, but could we roll back now to your early life? What was your childhood like, and were you interested in kind of science and technology from a young age?
I grew up in India, so I didn't move to the UK until I was 17. So as different from my children's childhood as I can imagine. I grew up in Mumbai, which is a really big city, in, no houses, only apartments, not very green, but kind of a very different buzz and energy compared to living in like suburban London. And my family has always been kind of very scientific and mathematical. So I was always kind of interested in those kinds of things. But for me, it was always a battle between my love for language and books, and my fascination with science, particularly like medicine, biology. And when it came to kind of what I would study, I had exactly that same sort of conflict where I was like, should I study English or should I be a scientist? And ended up studying biology, sticking with it, and getting a master's degree also in immunology. So I was really fascinated by disease, and I worked on developing an HIV vaccine for a couple of years. But then at that point kind of was like, is this going to be me forever? Am I going to be a scientist in a lab wearing protective equipment and pipetting blood all day long? Is this my passion? Or am I going to take the plunge and kind of follow this other path that I've always wanted, which was to write? And I decided to make the jump. But for me, I always wanted to use my kind of passion and understanding of scientific and complex concepts, technology too now, and kind of decode that for the wider public, to kind of bring it to people who wouldn't otherwise think that they care about something. That's kind of always been my motivation. So I've ended up, I think, kind of marrying these two passions that have always defined me, which was always, which was writing as well as complexity and kind of scientific innovation. And I think the book is a culmination of that, because I've tried, I actually had a friend who just said she finished reading it in 2 days because she's never reads about technology. She's not interested in it. And she said it was so unexpected. And the reason I read it all so quickly is because it was the human stories. And I didn't think I would care, but I did. And that's kind of what I strive for in anything that I write, which is, you might not think you're a techie, geeky person, but here's why this matters to you. Here's why this is important for you to understand if you're a person living in our world today.
And we saw that you then did another master's in journalism in the US. What was the decision to go to America like for that? And two kind of specific questions. We saw that there was you did a course on writing a non-fiction book. And I'd be interested to know how studying that in theory and in an academic context compared to your later experience of actually writing one.
Yeah, so the decision to go to America was because I studied here. I had been at Oxford for 4 years. I'd come from India, come straight into Oxford. It was a huge culture shock for me. But it was an amazing kind of, real like embedding into English culture and like understanding all of these different like weird class systems and pop culture references, and I loved it, and I met my husband while I was there. But I felt like if I was going to make the jump into something so completely different, into journalism, I didn't want it to be a sort of tentative step in that direction where I kind of stuck to my comfort zone as an academic. I didn't want to study journalism in a theoretical way and kind of think about like, oh, maybe I do sort of science writing for technical journals. I was kind of like, if I'm going to write, I want to make this jump and I want to try and do it as dramatically as I can and learn the craft. And the course that I found at NYU was actually focused on science, health, and environmental reporting. And it was for people who had a background in science. And I really loved that because it was in New York, in the kind of hub and in the midst of all of the options that you have there in New York. But at the same time, it was, leveraging the work and the expertise and knowledge that I'd spent time on over the last 4 years or more of my life. So that's kind of why I decided to go there. And I felt like it would be more practical. Everything that I could see here in the UK felt more scholarly. So I decided to make the jump. It was probably the best decision I made, just because I did tons of like internships and started to understand the media landscape a lot better. I think I'd been cocooned a lot more at university here. And kind of, it was how I was introduced to Wired, for example. I interned for them while I was there, and kind of brought me onto the path of technology, which again, when I came into it, I thought, I'm not a gadget geek. I don't care about this stuff. But it kind of made me realize how this was much more of a sociological thing. It was, it kind of crossed over into politics, into science. And that's why I've ended up spending the rest, or my whole career really, writing about technology and society.
And how did you fund the Masters at NYU? Did you have support from grants and things, or was it kind of entirely self-funded?
Partly self-funded. I did get a part of it. It was a scholarship that I got out there as well. They had merit-based rather than need-based, which was helpful. So I think it kind of paid for particularly my living costs while I was out there, which New York is a very expensive city, but otherwise it was self-funded. It's hard, right? Because the internships that I did, the one at Wired, which was owned by Condé Nast, they pay something like at the time $12 a day. It's not enough pay to sustain you. It's not a job, and you have to be able to do that. And to be able to do that, I think, you have to be in a privileged position. So I definitely see how, those opportunities can be really unequal. But for me, it felt like, it really helped me to change my mindset from that of a scientist into kind of a reporting mindset.
And can you tell us about your steps after that? So you were an intern at Nature and then moving to Wired. What was that experience like?
Yeah, so I interned at Wired US, where I wrote for a couple of their blogs based out of New York, including Danger Room, which was focused on sort of military tech, and like really kind of outlandish stuff that DARPA and DoD were funding, which was super futuristic, like robotics and so on. So I wrote for them for a bit. And then I did an internship at Nature Medicine News as well. So that was actually really fascinating because I was looking for news that was going to be relevant to a scientific audience, but also, kind of had to figure out what's something that isn't just science for the sake of science, but something that kind of has a wider context and, impact for not just scientists. But again, it was pretty for an academic audience. So when I came back to the UK and started my first job at Wired, I think it was a real learning curve of kind of moving out of the mindset of writing for a very kind of scientifically literate audience and figuring out kind of what makes a good story, starting from the basics. Because I think my course at NYU, while it was really great for kind of the craft of reporting and writing, and Simon, you'd mentioned also I did a course on nonfiction book writing, which kind of gave me a sense of what is a book proposal to begin with. It was meant to be for scientists who are going to end up doing science communication or write about popular science, not so much technology. So I think with Wired, it was really kind of my time of understanding just what is a good story. How do you find the people and the ideas that are going to appeal to an average person? But I would say less of developing news judgment there, that we didn't really care about what was in the news. It was like, what's the most like interesting thing that we can write about that's going to excite somebody who cares about innovation. But it was really fun place to start out because I met the most amazing people.
What was the kind of pace of production in terms of your own output at that stage in your career? Was there an expectation of how many words or how many articles you would produce?
No, it wasn't like that. I was on the print magazine, and it was still a time in 2012 when like the print product was the sort of crown jewels. And it seems so crazy to look back now because obviously every media company has, not just pivoted to having a website. It's kind of the primary way in which people really access media these days is through a device, right? Or either on a through a website or an app or whatever, or social media. But at the time, the print product was the kind of heart of the whole operation. So we worked 3 months ahead. So again, it constantly felt like you were living in the future, because if you were in January, you're producing a magazine for sort of April. So you're looking for stories and things that are relevant for an audience in April, May. And there was a lot of the work was around not just the story itself, but around photography, design, because it was such a visual product, such a visual magazine. So I would say, I was really spoilt there in terms of pace compared to working later for the Telegraph and now at the FT, which has the very much a daily newspaper rate of production. There it was much, it was a lot of, it was hard work, because you have to put together whatever it was. At one point I was editing 20 pages, and you need to have the layout and the photos, all of that done, well in advance. So it was just a very different kind of pressure and pace, and much more about looking ahead rather than what's happened today.
And can you tell us about these stints at the Telegraph that you did later, and then when you went back to America as a Lawrence Stern Fellowship?
Yeah, so the Telegraph. So as I've said, I didn't grow up in the UK. I grew up in India, so I'd not really been embedded in the news media of the UK, and I didn't really have the same touch points of the role that the Telegraph plays in public life here, or kind of what people's assumptions of it are, or any of that. I didn't come in with any preconceived notions. For me, it was just an opportunity to lead a team, and that they took a chance on me, having come from a monthly magazine to leading the tech team at a daily newspaper, right? So it was a big jump for me in terms of a steep learning curve. And I was there for about a year, and I would say it was an amazing learning experience in so many ways. Understanding how Fleet Street papers work, what are the dynamics in a newsroom, who holds power, how do you have a voice? I was one of the few, female leads of a desk, and younger than some of the other editors of the other desks. So it was kind of, how do I kind of make sure people understand what my expertise is, and kind of, and I don't think it was a struggle or there was pushback. It was just sort of gaining the trust of people around me when I was very different from them in many ways. But, I learned how to be a news journalist at the Telegraph. I learned about scoops, which I'd never really thought about at Wired, because we were doing everything 3 months in advance and everything we wrote was new. And even if something happened in the news and we had something, I have to say we weren't even that concerned. I remember we'd spent months with DeepMind, which is now owned by Google, the AI company, and Demis Hassabis, who founded it, and his team. My editor had been spending time. He's like, this is a really interesting company. And we had this big feature. And before it was about to come out, the news was announced that they were acquired by Google. And people were like, oh, should we put that online? Nah, it's in next month's issue, so we'll just wait and do that. There was just no sort of concern about, we can capitalize on online traffic because we literally have, the inside scoop on this company everybody wants to know about. So it was so different, which was, kind of amazing in its own way. Obviously, the Telegraph was very much, how can we leverage what's happening in the news? How can we get ahead of others who are our peers? And so I got to write columns too, which was my first foray into kind of opinion, which was fascinating, because I had to figure out what is my opinion on this? And I think that really helps, when I wrote my book later, where also I was told, we want to see you on the page and what you think. And when you spend years as a news journalist, trying to not put yourself into stories, I think writing a column weekly for the Telegraph really helped me to figure out what do I think about these issues and concepts, and where do I stand. So I think it was definitely a baptism of fire there, and I think the FT feels a lot more like a medium between Wired and the Telegraph, which is probably for me the kind of the perfect landing, because I think I'm somewhere in between a hard-nosed newsy journalist, although I think I've evolved more in that direction, and somebody who likes to kind of do the slow burn, longer kind of step back pieces.
You mentioned scoops. How do you get them, and how do you kind of nurture sources and make them give them to you?
Wow, this is the big question for any journalist, right? How do we do it? But yeah, I think I remember like a couple of years in to being at the FT, when I first started, I was the European technology correspondent writing about really everything, all tech stories outside of the West Coast US time zone. So it was just a lot of stuff. But a couple of years in, we reorganized. So we had our own tech desk and we had more people covering tech as well. So it meant I had just returned from my fellowship at the Washington Post, had a baby. And so it felt like a good moment to kind of think about, so what areas am I going to focus on? And for me at that point, it was I was really interested in surveillance, facial recognition. Again, the AI was the theme there, but particularly interested in biometrics. And then facial recognition became an area that I ended up spending almost a year really focused on. And at the time, I spoke to a colleague of mine at the FT, and he breaks lots of stories in a very different area and kind of about his methodology. How do you do this? How do you get scoops? As I was trying to plan for the year. And, he does things very differently from me, and the people he talks to are not tech people, and they operate differently. But the thing that stuck with me was, when he said, you've just got to constantly just speak to people, not because there's a particular story, but just catching up on what's exciting them, what's bothering them, what's interesting, and just you keep checking in every so often. And from those conversations, things happen. So I did that in my way, which was not necessarily like going to parties or drinks and kind of like socializing with my sources, which isn't really my style. But it was much more speaking to, academics, really, scientists, researchers, and slowly people who were academics but had started to work in tech companies because the two worlds started to merge so much. And then, activists who often have a line into a lot of these places, and kind of slowly widened my pool of the people I would regularly check in with. And that's when you start finding patterns, right? You start connecting the dots. So I remember one of my kind of big scoops in 2019 was around how King's Cross, the owners of King's Cross, had installed cameras across the whole area and were using facial recognition on pedestrians. It's not illegal, but obviously it wasn't signposted, and they'd been doing this for a long time and working with the Met Police to do so. And that, I remember that scoop just came about because I'd been speaking for so long to people in that world. And kind of they were talking about there's more and more, private sector shops and bars that are doing this. And I would talk to lots of the owners. I talked to the owner of Gordon's Wine Bar who had installed facial recognition in there. I was like, okay, this is interesting, the sort of merging of public and private surveillance as a theme. And then I remember just speaking to somebody one day who was like, oh, yeah, they're doing this at Canary Wharf and they're doing this at King's Cross. And I was like, sorry, what? What? And it really surprised me. And I remember just ringing Argent, which is the owner of King's Cross, and being like, do you have cameras scanning people's faces and trying to recognize them? They were like, yeah. And I just remember that moment of like, oh my gosh. So often it's kind of looking for the threads that others aren't looking at, and when you kind of keep going at it, you find the things that people don't even realize is a story until you write about it. But yeah, I don't think there's any one formula. That's my other big takeaway, because I used to worry when I was earlier in my career that I had to like take sources out and wine and dine them, or kind of be super kind of like take them out and then like get their secrets. But I don't think I don't believe that that's the only way to do it. I think taking time to understand an area so that experts in the area respect you as somebody who understands and who reports accurately on this means that people come to you. So it's often just like a self-fulfilling cycle, that you're rewarded for the work that you do.
Another point that's often raised in discussion of tech is the whole kind of access trade that reporters have to make, that how, I mean, this is a truism in all forms of journalism, but particularly with these large, powerful companies, that there's a sense that sometimes people are pulling their punches because they don't want to get frozen out. And as someone who has written, pretty critically about aspects of this world, how do you negotiate that piece in terms of do the big players keep talking to you, or is there a sense that the FT has sufficient institutional heft that you will get the access? How do you walk that line?
It's really interesting. Look, I don't know why they continue to talk to me, because my work is out there for everyone to see. That what I hope it is, and what I believe it is that I always make sure to kind of talk to the companies and kind of understand things, even if it's a story where it's kind of very negative about a company. I wrote, for example, about a really kind of egregious sexual harassment assault really case at DeepMind, but the wider story was about how the institution responded to it and the HR practices around how they kind of protect the largely male researchers over the usually more junior or kind of non-scientific female employees. Very difficult story to write. Not a lot that, the conversation with DeepMind, there wasn't a lot they could explain for it. It was obviously very much like, can you confirm all of these things? It felt, it was a difficult thing. But ultimately, they still talk to me now. I still write about them for many other things. And I hope it's because, I think you have to be fair. And if you're writing kind of problematic things about these companies and their impacts, you're doing the due diligence. And also I try and be, and I think this is because of the FT as well. Like, we don't have an ideology. It's not like I'm trying to make a point, that goes beyond just what the reporting shows. So I think it tends to, I think the way we kind of write and present our stories is neutral. It's kind of, here's what happened, here's what it says, here are the implications, here's why it matters. And it's not ideological or political or personal. And I have found that even, yes, you're right, tech companies can be, they can be very sensitive, and they do have the power to lock you out. And I have heard in many cases of companies locking reporters, blocking them out. But I think that if they feel like, that fair enough, you did the work on this and it's accurate, they might not love me, or I don't know how they feel about kind of the reporting, but they will keep coming back because they believe we do accurate reporting. So I think that's kind of how I balance it out, where it's not ideological or philosophical, but I will kind of expose what I think are kind of problematic trends and themes. And so far, I don't feel I've been blocked out particularly. I've had moments of that for sure, periods of it. But I hope ultimately, I think partly it's the FT's institutional heft, of course. If I went out on my own, I don't know that people would still want to talk to me, obviously. But that they do keep talking to us, and they do want the FT to kind of report fairly on the work that they're doing.
You obviously are the FT's first AI editor. What were the conversations around that role in 2023, and why did the paper feel that your role needed to be sort of described in that way, or kind of take on a certain scope?
Yeah, it's interesting because it was coincidental with ChatGPT coming out at a very similar time. And in fact, I was on book leave at the time. But this was a conversation that had started much before that. And it was really, I had spent the previous 3-4 years writing quite a lot about AI, amongst other things. I was interested in privacy, in regulation, in data as a business model. I've written about sort of healthcare data, ad tech data. So AI kind of was the thread running through a lot of the work I was doing. And I think even in the year before ChatGPT, our editor, Rula, had become really interested in kind of how AI was so quickly being infused into a lot of the tech products that we use every day, and was becoming sort of quite crucial to the business models or the future plans of a lot of the big tech companies. She was also, like me, hearing it come up again and again as sort of the next wave of technological change. And so the conversation there was really, you've been reporting on this for a long time. We want to kind of become, we want to be the trusted voice on this new kind of theme. It touches so many different areas that the FT is interested in, obviously the technology industry itself, but politics, policy and regulation. It touches so many other industries, whether that's media or retail or industrial manufacturing, logistics, like everything we write about, financial services, of course. So we felt that that this was a moment to kind of double down on this area and try and and be leaders of coverage in it. So that was the thinking behind it, and I think the timing worked well, because then over the last year the story has exploded, and it's been really useful to just kind of be able to be across a lot of the stories that lots of correspondents are thinking about and are coming in and say, well, this has actually been around for ages and is nothing new, whereas actually this is quite interesting. And it's helped us, I think, as an organization. I think we've been smart about how we've covered AI, all the, correspondents in all their respective areas, compared to, some who just are just writing every single story, because everything feels mad and new and crazy. And it's really hard to separate, the kind of wheat from the chaff. So I think our goal was to be smart on this, to kind of to leverage our institutional expertise and experience. It wasn't just me, right? Richard Waters, who's led our West Coast Bureau for many years, had also been fascinated by AI and been writing about it for many years. So we felt like we had and John Thornhill as well, 2 or 3 people who'd been, deep in this area for many years and who could bring that sort of sensible, let's kind of be smart about this to the mad coverage that has ensued over the past year or so.
And could you tell us how the book came about? We should say here that you have the same literary agent, Patrick Walsh, as represents Rachel and myself. But how did it begin as a project, and then how did you juggle it with your day job?
Basically, I had a baby in the pandemic. She was born in April 2020. So if you just cast your minds back, quite a crazy, weird time. And when I came back home and everything was shut down, I had a toddler as well. And I had kind of imagined that this would be like my easy year, because I'd had a child before. So the second time round, you kind of know how to handle a baby. Actually, the baby's the easy bit, compared to your toddler. And I was like, my older daughter will be at nursery and it's all just going to be like quite chilled out. Turned out she was at home with me for most of the year, as well as the baby. And so it was just a very intense time. I was not working. I took a year out for maternity leave, and kind of in that time, it was an amazing year to kind of be with my family. But it also made me think about, like, when I do go back, like, what creatively do I want my next challenge to be? It concentrates the mind in a way when you're at home, not working, but also in this very intense period with 2 very young children. And I love my job at the FT, still do. And really, I'm one of those people who has the opposite problem of the grass is greener, where I'm like, no, I'm really happy, so I'm not even going to look at anything else, which is not necessarily the best way to approach things. But I loved my job. I didn't want that necessarily to change, but I did feel like I wanted to flex some different creative muscles. So towards the end of my maternity leave, really, I'd started thinking about maybe that, for me, that challenge would be writing a book. And I'd had a conversation with someone previously about what would I write about. And they'd helped me figure out, it was a different agent actually. And she sort of helped me to figure out that what I really care about is people. Even though I've written about kind of quite complex, science, technology, I've never written about politics, areas that people would assume are, what you would write about if you loved kind of people and relationships. But I've always kind of worked, reported on very technical things. But the thing that drives me in the storytelling that I do is people, and kind of how that impacts people and how it changes lives. So I kind of knew that if I wrote something on, it would be about, how our lives are changed by technology in some way. So it came about then, and I met Patrick through a former colleague at Wired, who he also represents. And I kind of just had this Zoom call with him because we were still kind of in and out of lockdown. And I presented, I was like, this is my idea. And he bought into it straight away. So I basically spent the next few months working through my proposal alongside work. But it just, it never felt to me like this is an extra thing that's taking up my time. It was just always, so for me, like this exciting thing. It was like a very personal, private thing of my own at a time when I was so kind of busy with young children and work, and I was kind of needed in all these different ways by different people. But this was kind of my thing that I kind of loved doing, and it just felt like a privilege rather than work. So yes, like I look back and think like how obviously, my husband took on a huge amount of load, being allowed the space and time to write is such a privilege. And, my kids at the time they were babies. I couldn't have them and write at the same time. I needed the space. And so he would often take them out on a Saturday for like most of the day while I desperately wrote as quickly as I could. So yeah, I think the whole, I partly did it alongside work. I spent about 6 months doing both. And then I took 5 months of book leave as well from the FT to finish. Also not just to write, but I traveled to a lot of the places in my book. So it was definitely a juggle between like the various kind of responsibilities, and also my desire to spend time at home with my children, but it's been like one of the most fulfilling creative experiences I've ever had, and I've really loved every minute of it.
Well, that would be a lovely note to end on, but I'm going to end on a much more obvious question instead, which I'm sure you get all the time, which is, what is your opinion on what generative AI in particular means for the future of journalism and writing?
I think a lot about generative AI and creativity, because obviously, it comes so close to the things that we do in our jobs, to writing or making pictures or video and audio, and I think for a long time I resisted, in the sense that I saw what it could do, and I think Salman Rushdie was in the news saying this, like it's only going to replace, he said, science fiction and thriller writers, because that stuff is formulaic, but when it comes to like serious novelists, it's no patch on us. And I wouldn't go quite that far, but I do agree that it still is in a stage where it feels very generic and predictable. And it same goes for journalism, right? Like, yes, you can use a generative AI to write predictable, obvious, fill in the blanks journalism, but the things that people really go to a publication for, a newspaper, a podcast, a magazine, is for either the things that surprise them, that they didn't think they were interested in, but are just so delightful or fascinating to read, that they feel that their subscription was worth it, right? Or something that you work constantly are facing in your daily life, and you go to a newspaper or news publication to make sense of it. Why does this matter? What's the wider context around the work I'm doing, or what's the future of what I'm doing? Where is this going? To be more informed, and kind of stay on top of your expertise in your area. And both of those things, I think, you can't, with today's generative AI, you can't do. But that doesn't mean that it's getting better, right? It is going to move in a direction where maybe we will see glimpses of originality, not because they're in any way sentient or conscious, but just unexpectedly through joining various pieces of information, remixing, regurgitating, you can have kind of what looks like original ideas or like kind of new thoughts. So yeah, I'm not an ostrich burying my head in the sand. Today, I don't think any of the things that makes real good journalism unique, I don't think generative AI can do. But I think moving forward, the question to ask is, okay, if generative AI can do good journalism, what then becomes the role of human journalists? And maybe the question is not so much will we be replaced, but how does our job change so that we're doing what we do best and better than a generative AI system? And that might not be just writing the inverted pyramid of news, or just like necessarily, an analysis of something that's happened. Maybe generative AI can do that, but it's, being trusted sources, making sure that everything we report is accurate and true, uncovering the things that are hidden. So we'll have to figure out kind of where do we fit in a world where words are cheap, or kind of mass creativity is the norm. And I don't think that, that for me, that doesn't mean there won't be journalism. There might be a kind of a winnowing away of, you won't have as much of a kind of plurality of media, and maybe you lose some great kind of publications in the process. There will be pain, I think, but I think it will evolve. It will evolve, and human journalists will find our new role in a new media landscape.
Great. Well, look, thank you, Madhu, for a really wide-ranging and fascinating interview, and we wish you all the best with the book and with all your other work going forward.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Madhumita Murgia. She's on Twitter at Madhumita29, and her new book, Code Dependent, is published by Picador. Hello, it's us again. Simon, what was your takeaway from the interview with Madhu?
I thought it was a really interesting interview. I mean, touching on both her own career, but an area in terms of AI that is of such significance for the wider world at the moment, and also, as we alluded to what's going to happen to journalism and writing and the creative professions. And I thought also she was actually, beyond the particularities of her beat, she was very good on the specifics of being a reporter for a big publication, of developing sources, of breaking scoops, and that kind of craft element. What did you think?
Absolutely agree. I think it's a timely interview, and she was very thoughtful on what the bigger picture is as well. I really enjoyed reading her book. As I mentioned, and as we were just talking about off air, the chapter on deepfakes is really alarming and disturbing, and she does a great job of looking beyond Silicon Valley to how it affects ordinary people's lives. So yes, it's an enjoyable read. What have you been up to, Simon?
I'm back in the UK actually, because I managed to lose my phone in a snowstorm in the Alps, and it turned out that the easiest way to get a replacement was to come back here and get a new SIM card and do various kind of administrative tedium things. So that's okay. But I skied the Haute route, which is the kind of thing that my book is about, without mountain guides and continuously from beginning to end, in 5 days. So I feel I've kind of done the big finale that I needed for my book, by its kind of purest and most difficult line. So that's good. So I feel a bit like I'm kind of over the hump with that. But yeah, very much in the last sort of few days, or few weeks of this bit of the project. And then my cultural appetite, I watched the season finale of Masters of the Air, which I thought was a bit better actually. I thought it had recovered from its dip, although it was all a bit like stirring and sort of, I just feel there's a bit of a dive into like simplistic flag waving a little bit, which it could have done better. But anyway, Rachel, what have you been up to?
You've really taken listeners on a journey with your feelings of Masters of the Air.
I hope they appreciate it.
What have I been doing? I've been working on various pieces, and I watched a film recently actually that's coming out in the UK in May called Love Lies Bleeding, which was pretty violent. It made me, I think it's a sign that Rose Glass, the filmmaker, knew what she was doing, because I felt quite nauseous for several hours afterwards, and I wouldn't say I'm someone who's that squeamish. So yeah, just kind of trucking along really.
This has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acombe.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin, our score is by Jess Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Twitter at Take Notes Always. We're on Instagram at Always Take Notes. If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.